I'm actually, the best way to describe myself that I like to do is that I'm a student of development. So I've been in the field of development for 30 odd years, but I'm still learning. And I was actually tuning into your conference a few minutes earlier and to listen to all these wonderful stories from beneficiaries who are actually at the forefront of financial inclusion. It's absolutely amazing to hear the stories. And of course, Kenya is a leader in many aspects of financial inclusion. So if it's all right with you, Professor, I had a few slides I wanted to share, and hopefully the technology will help me since I'm working from home early in the morning today. So I see my colleagues have already put up the slide, which is very good, and I'll ask them to move the slide as we go along. So can we move to the next slide, please? So I actually thought I'd share some thoughts on the frontiers of financial inclusion. You all who have been at this conference for the last 2 days, I know you have discussed a lot of very important issues, and you are all among the converts to the world of financial inclusion. And what I believe is that over the last 2.5 years, the multiplicity of shocks that we have all seen, that the world has faced, that all the African countries have faced, in some ways that has elevated the importance of financial inclusion. And if we were to reimagine the world going forward, then financial inclusion has to be at the center of it. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. So I think my first message I wanted to leave with you is that financial inclusion is really a transformational agenda for the world in the light of everything that we have been going through, continue to go through. The second, and I'm sure your discussions over the last 2 days, you have talked about also the challenge of, can you please keep the same slide, please, on the messages? You have also talked about innovation and the digital aspects of financial inclusion. When I was growing up in India, financial inclusion meant that the postman would come to your door and start a small postal savings account, and my mother would put some money in it, and that money would accumulate. But now we live in a world of digital and solutions, and a lot can be done in the aspects of payments and savings, credit and insurance. I wanted to talk a little bit about digital because that is absolutely transformational, not only in the financial inclusion space, but in so many other spaces of development that I work on, and that we all work on. And my final message is the importance of integrating all the different dimensions, functionalities, that is in the space of financial inclusion, from maximizing the impact on growth, on creating jobs, and on reducing poverty and inequality, which is really what we are all after. So all of these things are instruments to achieve the goals of improving the lives of people in all of our countries. Next slide, please. So talking a little bit about financial inclusion and its importance in supporting resilience in the face of shocks. And these are very intuitive things, and we have all seen that in the pandemic, and you have seen that in Kenya, but in so many other countries where the digital infrastructure that the digital infrastructure and the payment system has really enabled government services to continue. It has enabled financial payments to be made. But more importantly, it has enabled the government to scale up the support to people in dire need as economies were closed. The cash transfer programs, whether it is in South Africa or in other countries where cash transfers were scaled up in big time, or whether it was for people just to make online payments in order to procure the goods and services they needed, even as the economies and mobility was limited. So in many countries, of course, digital solutions have enabled schools to stay open and for teaching to continue for those who had access, of course, to these services. So I think COVID and the pandemic has taught us the importance of connectivity. But then so also when we talk about the food security challenges in many parts of the world, and I think in the Horn of Africa, of course, that has been a huge challenge. And we are finding that solutions such as e-vouchers, and again, this is something that Kenya has been a leader on the continent in e-vouchers that farmers are now able to use to procure seeds and fertilizers. And it is also expanding now to countries like Zambia and Tanzania and Malawi and other countries where e-vouchers are really transforming the way government programs are delivering services to farmers. But then also with climate change more generally, where smallholder farmers, for instance, in Mali, can use index insurance to cope with severe storms and other places. So these are all interconnected challenges where financial inclusion systems are enabling governments to be responsive to people, for people to benefit from and maintain their services, and to be able to be resilient to some of these shocks. Next slide, please. So coming from that, I wanted to present to you a very simple framework for thinking about financial inclusion, and all of you are experts, and there are many frameworks out there. But I thought, at the end of the day, of course, financial inclusion is all about services such as payments, savings, credit, and insurance that impacts upon people, upon firms, and upon farms. But these services don't exist in a vacuum, of course. They need to have the basic digital public infrastructure, and they need to have the legal and regulatory frameworks. This is, the ecosystem in some ways for financial inclusion is quite challenging to develop, and many countries are still, on a path of on a journey to try to improve these systems. In many countries, if you don't have power, for instance, you can't have connectivity. So in some ways, having access to power and reliable power is the foundation for even, having connectivity and supporting digital financial inclusion. But then so also are all the other concerns that we have in terms of, data security, of data protection, consumer protection, and various other things. So the whole legal regulatory framework, which is something that governments work on, which is what the public good that they provide in order for financial inclusion systems to operate. So I wanted to leave this a simple framework as you think of, as we talk a little bit more in this presentation about financial inclusion. What this framework also, of course, embeds is the partnership between the public sector, i.e. the government, and the private sector. Because there are some things that are better done and provided, for instance, the legal and regulatory framework that has to come from the government and public entities, whereas, of course, some of the other things, are that we would want the private sector to be much more actively involved in this. So this partnership is absolutely essential in order to make this whole. Next slide, please. I just wanted to spend maybe 30 seconds on talking about how technology has been reshaping our lives, and of course reshaping financial inclusion. And we have all lived, some of us have lived longer than others in the room, I'm sure, and maybe I have lived longer than many of you. But over the years, there have been so many different technological evolutions, and they've had massive impact on financial services in general. From the growth of credit cards and messaging services to ATMs. I remember when ATMs were first introduced, it was quite exciting. But now we are all in this whole world of digital banking, and we don't even have a full comprehension of what the future actually beholds for us, with all the technological improvements when it comes to artificial intelligence and machine learning and big data and open banking and technology. So technology has been changing very rapidly. We all know that. Internet has been one of the most transformational things of the 20th century, and and the Internet of Things is reshaping our lives. But it enables us to reimagine development, reimagine how countries can progress, how growth and development can take place, how we can leapfrog the space of development in ways that were unimagined when, in the early years, in the post-independence era, when many of the countries in Africa, including my country in India, became independent. The way that development has been progressing and how services are being provided to people, was unimaginable in those early days. But we live in this world of exciting opportunity that technology provides, with many of the risks also, of course, in terms of inequality, in terms of data security issues, and those are some of the challenges we'll talk a little bit, along the way. Next slide, please. So I wanted to focus on a couple of major technological changes, which I think are going to shape the future. already shaping it in many countries. And one is the whole notion of digital stacks, where you have a combination of common standards, open interfaces, data interoperability, and various functionalities that actually come together. And for me, the most fascinating experience has really been from India, where some of you may have heard of how the government of India, has been trying to bring together the opening of bank accounts with the unique ID system, the Aadhaar, the largest ID system in the world, where 1.1 or 1.2 billion people now have the ID card, and moving on to connecting it to mobile services. So the J stands in Indian language in Hindi for Jan Dhan, which is people's money. So it's people's money, the Aadhaar, which is the ID system, and mobile. And that is absolutely transforming the way businesses are done, that people actually live their day-to-day lives in India. But then we also have examples from other parts of the of the world. And I have an example on the slide, which is from Colombia, where also the Ingreso Solidario, the new social assistance program in response to COVID-19, has been using a similar type of an approach. The different countries are at different stages of how they integrate the functionality and the different systems. But the potential for reach of this, the fact that ID systems, unique ID systems, can absolutely unlock the space for financial inclusion is absolutely remarkable. Next slide, please. The second big digital innovation in some ways that I wanted to share is really the whole thing on fast payments and open banking. And there are many examples, and I'm sure there are things going on in Kenya also that you are better aware of. But I wanted to just put the example of Brazil's Pix, which was developed by the Brazilian Central Bank, which embedded multiple functionalities for users and has transformed the retail payments from cash to digital. More than 100 million people have been using this, and this has all grown at a very rapid pace. And globally, the whole issue of open banking now has is taking shape, and it is absolutely fundamentally transforming the way banking is being done. In some countries, it is the approach is being driven rather through regulations, especially in the more advanced countries, but even in some of the emerging market countries. But then in others like Singapore and Japan, it is being driven in a much more collaborative approach. And while in the USA and New Zealand, open banking is being driven by industries. So this is again something that can transform things. So I wanted to actually focus on four different areas of the framework that I presented earlier in terms of how financial inclusion connects with people, firms, and farms. The first is on payments. And Kenya is, of course, a leader on the payments domain with the M-Pesa and the P2P transfers that were introduced, I guess, more than 10 years ago. And I'm sure many of you are constant users of that. But some of the areas that we feel that even in this post-COVID world that we are living in now, that is very transformative is how e-remittances have now taken off. COVID actually brought a halt to remittances, the normal flow of remittances. I've had long conversations on this, for instance, with the governor of the Central Bank of Somalia, which is heavily dependent on remittances. And it posed a huge challenge in the initial days. But then people started using e-remittances a lot more, and many of these remittances that used to go through informal channels started coming through regular banking channels. There are countries, of course, that have structured it in a very deliberate manner. For example, Malaysia, which actually opened up the end-to-end digital financial services targeting immigrants, and thousands of immigrants were registered. The other big change coming in that space is really on reducing the cost of remittances. And there are many factors that account for the cost of remittances, including the high fees that some banks might be charging for remittances. But the advantage of and remittances through digital services, of course, is that it reduces a lot of these middle charges and the brokerage fees, and has reduced the cost of these remittances, which means that the beneficiaries get more of remittances. People payments, huge examples from and other places, and we all know that that is much more common across the continent of Africa also. I already mentioned the P2P on Kenya, but then we also have the approaches towards embedded finance that digital payments are actually facilitating, where women-led SMEs in a host of countries around the world in different continents are able to access e-commerce platforms, hands-on coaching to connect with financial services and use digital payments. And this is absolutely, fascinating to follow some of the advances in these areas, and what the frontier beholds for us, because this is absolutely critical to reduce some of the gender imbalances in financial services that I'm sure you must have discussed over the last 2 days. And finally, on how digital payments are enabling business platforms to take shape, and the example I have is from India, where Echo has leveraged APIs to integrate agent management systems to bill payments and money transfer systems, etc. I use one of these platforms myself from India to make electricity and telephone payments for my family back home in India. The second area of this interface between financial inclusion and people on the service space that I wanted to touch upon is really the importance of savings, pensions, and investments. So, I used to live in South Africa, and I think Prof mentioned in his introduction, I used to live in South Africa, and we did a lot of work on townships, and many of you, many African countries, including Kenya, of course, have the issue of informal settlements in urban areas. And one of the things that really amazed me in townships is how people had come together to develop informal savings accounts through a traditional system in South Africa called Stockwells, or basically, I guess these are savings clubs. And I'm sure you also have some version of that in your own country. And that became a lifeline for many people, even during COVID, but even before COVID, even in normal times, for them to provide microfinance liquidity in an informal manner for people to seek opportunities and promote economic, access to income opportunities. But the challenge for us as a development student, as a practitioner, the challenge for us is that how can we actually build upon some of those models and use digital solutions to formalize those savings, bring them into the banking system, into the formal system, so that they can have more impact and can be better structured. Uganda is one case, and there are many other cases where savings solutions are being promoted very actively. Digital pensions is a huge area for growth, and again, both for the formal but also for the informal systems. And there are innovations underway for how pensions can also be provided for informal segments of the population. And we know for many of our countries, informal economy is a huge one. And also of how investments can be done. Of course, we have very good examples from the more advanced parts of the world on investments through mobile payments, and Africa still has to catch up on some of these things. But these are all, in some ways, the frontiers for how financial inclusion can promote investments to help create jobs and economic opportunity. Next slide, please. The third area is really that the interface that I wanted to talk about is really on credit and MSME financing. And here there are various examples for how this can be done. And for me, it has been fascinating, when you talk about development on how one actually can move from informal economy to more formal and more productive parts, structures of the economy. The example from South Africa has been very striking also, where a lot of the credit that households at least use upon are really stored credits. But now financial inclusion and digital solution actually provides opportunity for using alternative data sets to help build credit history. In Kenya, I know that there have been efforts to also see how psychometric techniques can actually look and enable people who come without any collateral, who may not have ID systems, etc., can help. We have had huge success in Ethiopia using psychometric techniques, particularly for women who want to perhaps access credit for the first time from the formal system. So this formalization of credit, opening up opportunities for women, and using alternative data is opening up new markets and is opening up new opportunities. And I think this is a game changer in how some of these alternative data, including big data, can actually play in that space. Data platforms and credit invoices, I talked about it in different contexts also, but also in the context of credit and MSC financing. There are many examples from Latin America, and I have an example here from Argentina of how MSMEs have been are able to get access to market intelligence tools, various financial information on these platforms, and has led to huge growth on an annual basis of electronic credit invoices negotiated in the market. And there are many different examples of that I'm sure you are familiar with, or we can discuss later. Digital credit, and there's a whole scope of world that is opening up in that space. And even in unexpected places like Myanmar. For me, it was a surprise when we were preparing this presentation for this event that I learned that even Myanmar is in some ways a leader in this field of digital credit, and where farmers, particularly focused on farmers, where fascinating ways of linking up mobile phone numbers and weather-based agricultural intelligence services, and on a digital platform that provides for credit scoring, etc., all comes together in order to provide farming services, credit to farmers. And the final area of this interface is really on insurance. And insurance, I think it is an underdeveloped area, at least in many of the emerging markets, and especially on the African continent. And it is something that we believe that has tremendous growth potential. Especially in the interconnected world that we live in. And there are different ways of thinking about it. The examples here are maybe covering travel and ride cover for day-to-day type of needs that people might have, especially the emerging middle classes who are much more conscious of this. But there is insurance products, of course, in other places that also are being developed to protect people, especially farmers and rural communities, from disaster risk and other natural disasters. So let me spend maybe a minute on the policy agenda in how do we make it all happen. So the world that beckons us is there, but how do we actually make it happen in a way that all of our countries, especially countries on the African continent, actually can benefit from it? And there's a huge policy agenda. A lot of it is within the control, within the purview of the government. Competition and contestability is huge. We want to have many players in the market providing services. If not, we'll have all the challenges that monopoly power actually provides. Monopoly power can lead to, in which case costs might be high and service quality over time may not be as much. But it is absolutely important, contestability and competition also critical for innovation. And this is a hugely innovative space. And this is a huge challenge, because many would argue, some of you might argue, that almost by nature, technology has huge returns to scale and might actually facilitate the growth of monopoly power, as we see in the global space with some of the technology providers. and that risks, therefore, in the concentration of wealth and concentration of services in the hands of a few. So it is absolutely important that government policy actually promotes competition and contestability. But so also, it's important for market conduct and the promotion of financial literacy. I'm a great believer that for effective systems, we need to have a consumer base that is literate, whether it is in the financial space or whether it is in other different spaces, because an educated customer in many cases is absolutely essential for these market-based solutions to work. And technology can help in mitigating the risks from all of these new products and providers. But how the industry comes together to promote market conduct and how governments actually lay out the regulations and the legislation for that, and how all of us join hands to promote financial literacy becomes absolutely important. The digital financial services, it cannot be treated as if it's a given. It has to be nurtured, it has to be developed, it has to be supported. The role of the private sector in this space is absolutely critical, but so is of course the role of the government in providing the enabling infrastructure and the ecosystem for that. The credit infrastructure it raises also its own challenges in terms of how you ensure that the credit is provided in an equitable manner. Equity is, for me, it's absolutely core to development. We want to have development that is inclusive, and that is why I love the phrase financial inclusion also, because it has to be financial services for all, not only for a few, which unfortunately in many countries, that is the case. And how do you actually provide a credit infrastructure that supports all the whole population? And in that case, some of the alternative data techniques that we talked of I think they are hugely empowering of people. And finally, the big issue of cybersecurity and data protection. This is a huge agenda. And I think even the advanced countries are struggling with it. Of course, the EU has probably some of the toughest regulations on global data protection regulations. But it is something that every country will have to figure that out. And in Africa, I know that this is also a concern of the African Union. And this is something that requires also a lot of collaboration with other countries regionally and globally. But cybersecurity and data protection is absolutely essential to give the trust and the confidence in people to use digital services. So these are areas that I think have to be worked upon, and it requires continued effort and very proactive engagement by all. And these are new areas, so no one has a perfect solution for that, but we can learn from each other and from what other countries are doing and develop these things over time. Final slide, please. And that is just to say thank you for listening to me after lunch and before you close for this session. Thank you very much.